In the quiet backwoods of Missouri, deep in the fading shadows of the 19th century, there lived a doctor whose reputation was as clean and respectable as the polished brass on the instruments he carried. To neighbors, he was a dedicated man of medicine, a healer who had devoted his life to tending the sick and easing suffering in a time when cholera and fevers ravaged entire families. His name carried respect, but hidden behind the clapboard walls of his home, far from the eyes of those who trusted him, this doctor was experimenting so unspeakably, so grotesquely in its design, that its consequences would still echo long after his death. His subjects were not patients, travelers, or criminals. They were his own children. When the first rumors whispered through the small town, most dismissed them as the usual gossip that clung to frontier communities. Tales spun in saloons by men with too much whiskey in their bellies and too little truth in their tongues. But the truth was far darker than any rumor could capture. This doctor's secret obsession twisted not only the lives of his sons and daughters, but also distorted the entire idea of trust itself, leaving behind a legacy of horror, betrayal, and broken human lives. And what his neighbors could not have known was that he believed what he was doing was not murder nor cruelty, but science. A revolution of the human body. A rewriting of nature itself. The kind of ambition that bends morality until it snaps completely. Before we peel back the layers of this chilling story, I want you to do something simple but important. Hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell right now, because the disturbing story you are about to hear is exactly the kind of hidden history we uncover here together. And in the comments, let me know if you've ever heard even whispers of this Missouri nightmare. Today, we begin with a discovery that would shock the entire region. Missouri in the mid-19th century was a land of contradictions. A place carved out of rugged wilderness, where frontier families fought nature for survival, while at the same time attempting to build the institutions of civility that made them feel like part of a greater nation. In the river towns flourished merchants and lawyers, men of industry building mills, schools and courthouses, symbols of progress in a land still haunted by lawlessness. But beyond the towns, the woods stretched thick, lonely, and forbidding. Life in those margins required endurance, grit, and above all, self-reliance. Out there, a man's reputation was the strongest coin he could hold. Among them lived Dr. Thaddeus Grayling. That name would one day be spoken with fear and disgust, but in its own time, it carried respect. He moved through the streets of his Missouri town with calm purpose, dressed not in the rough leathers and homespun cloth of farmers, but in carefully pressed coats and polished boots. People noticed how his appearance never faltered, his dark hair slicked neatly into place, his mustache trimmed with the discipline one might expect from an army officer or a professional man rooted in learning rather than labor. Grayling was not just a doctor. He was one of the few educated men within 50 miles, a figure people instinctively looked to when cholera spread, through neighboring farms, or when burns from a cooking fire left a child screaming in anguish. Neighbors trusted him because they had little reason not to. His house doubled as an infirmary, where families came to seek relief for anything from snake bites to childbirth complications. His voice was quiet, reassuring, carrying a gentle authority that gave men confidence and women comfort. He was clever with herbs, relentless with poultices, and unafraid to try newer imported remedies that many rural physicians dismissed outright as city quackery. And unlike most men of medicine, who often demanded payments up front or refused to visit homes beyond the town limits, Grayling attended to even the poorest among them. In the minds of many, he was Missouri's version of the noble healer, the man who blended frontier grit with learned wisdom. But even in those early years, there were whispers. They were faint at first, mild amusements shared in hushed tones at church gatherings or bar rooms. How Grayling's children, 3 boys and 2 girls, rarely played with others. How they seemed nervous in his presence. How they carried bruises explained away by falls or chores, but too frequent to be without suspicion. Some felt the family seemed distant, their windows shuttered against curious eyes, even on bright summer days when everyone else opened their homes wide to the air. There was also the curious absence of Grayling's wife from community events. Though alive, few ever heard her voice above a whisper in public, and many remarked on how pale and diminished she seemed beside her formidable husband. Yet nothing ever rose to the level of true scandal, for his reputation outweighed their doubts.
And frontier families were too dependent on his medical skills to risk alienating him. Unbeknownst to his neighbors,
Grayling had a past that was far more troubling than they could imagine. Before Missouri, he had lived in Kentucky, where records showed a promising young doctor dismissed suddenly from a county hospital. The cause was officially labeled professional disagreements, which at the time was often shorthand for an incident too unsavory to be committed to public record. Grayling carried no letters of recommendation, no glowing references from colleagues, only the quiet specter of something that went wrong, and a hasty relocation westward where nobody thought to pry into the details. The frontier was good for that. It wiped slates clean, protected men's secrets, and allowed them to build facades with little fear of discovery. It was the perfect soil for a man like him. Yet what set Grayling apart was not simply his reputation as a doctor. It was his obsession. He believed, fervently, absolutely, that science had not yet reached its true potential. Nature itself was flawed, weak, and vulnerable to sickness, with inherited imperfections. To his mind, God had made man fragile, and it was the duty of enlightened men like himself to improve upon creation. Medicines cured illness. Surgery mended wounds. But what if one could go further? What if man himself could be rebuilt, reshaped, remade into something hardier, stronger, beyond ordinary humanity? These were questions Grayling pondered long into the night while his household slept in uneasy silence, and it was in his children that he saw both the opportunity and the excuse. For if he could not test on them, who else? What parent in the town would hand over a child for experimentation? What neighbor would allow a trusted physician to slice, probe, and inject for reasons beyond simple healing? The thought was unthinkable. But under his roof, where walls closed the outside world away, there were no barriers but his own restraint, and soon even that eroded. One evening, while his wife sat exhausted with fever near the hearth, Grayling summoned his eldest son, no older than 12, into his study. The boy would later be described as timid, slight of build, eager to please a father whose approval he rarely earned. That night would change his life forever. The doctor began with bloodletting, more extensive than traditional practice. He observed the boy's weakness, his pallor. He took notes. When his son fainted, he revived him with ammonia salts, then forced him to continue. According to entries later discovered in Grayling's journals, he justified it this way: better to subject a son to controlled suffering now than to leave him weak in manhood. He told himself the boy's body would adapt, would grow stronger, more resilient after trials of endurance. Then came more drastic measures: strange powders ground from imported chemicals. Experimental injections are administered into both the muscle and the vein. Some concoctions caused days of vomiting so violent that the boy's throat bled. Others left him shaking with fevers that bordered on the fatal. Every result was carefully recorded in Grayling's meticulous handwriting: dosage, reaction, observable behavior, and the boy's eventual recovery or decline. When neighbors asked about the child's weakness, Grayling would tell them he was prone to sickliness, that he had inherited a weak constitution. Most nodded sympathetically. On the frontier, sickly children were commonplace, and to suspect otherwise would mean challenging the one man responsible for treating their ailments. But Grayling did not stop with his eldest son. As months turned into years, one by one, his children were subjected to his insane vision of human improvement. His daughters were dosed with opiates disguised as cough medicine, not for illness but for observation. One was bled so frequently that her skin grew permanently pale. Experiments involving restricted diets and forced exposure to bitter tonics changed not only their bodies but their minds. They grew strange, frightened, withdrawn, even among themselves. The once lively children of the Grayling household became a shadowed collection of pale figures, haunting the edges of town life like specters. And still, no one dared question too deeply. It was a perfect storm of circumstance that allowed his cruelty to thrive. Missouri towns were scattered, law enforcement distant, records scarce. Abuse inside a household could be disguised as illness, malnutrition, or simple misfortune. And all the while, Grayling's public face remained untarnished. He healed neighbors' wounds, buried their dead, delivered their babies, and earned their eternal gratitude. To believe the healer could also be a torturer was simply beyond comprehension. Yet something was shifting. By the late 1850s, when whispers about his oddities became more insistent, pieces of the disguise began unraveling. A young farmhand, taken into the Grayling household for work, confided to his mother that he had overheard strange sounds echoing from the doctor's study late at night. Screams, muffled cries, the sharp metallic clink of instruments against wood. The boy was dismissed before any further questions could be asked. Others noticed the nervousness of the Grayling children at church, their trembling hands, the way they flinched if touched suddenly. Women remarked among themselves that Grayling's wife seemed broken, trapped in a silence that looked less like shyness and more like fear. But still, he was untouchable. To accuse him would mean risking exile from medical help, and worse, being ridiculed for daring to cast suspicion on the man everyone owed in some way. Grayling was an institution in himself, and by then his obsession was approaching frenzy. He began extending his experiments to endurance, forcing his children to spend nights without sleep under observation, measuring their decline, then documenting their slow recovery. He exposed them deliberately to illness to test how the body fought disease when aided or hindered by his concoctions. He was no longer searching for healing. He was prosecuting a campaign of transformation. His notes described it not as cruelty, but as progress toward a new kind of human resilience. Night bled into night as his experiments deepened, leaving scars on his children's bodies and souls alike. Sometimes, when they stumbled through town in rare appearances, neighbors glimpsed shadows of something monstrous forming in them. Not monsters in body, but in spirit. Fear twisted their gazes into something unrecognizable. Grayling had not yet created a stronger human, but he was making something else entirely. Creatures molded by terror, stripped of innocence, crushed beneath the weight of his ambition. And it would not be long before the fragile walls of silence collapsed, exposing the truth in ways no one in Missouri was prepared to face. By 1860, the Grayling household no longer bore resemblance to any other family dwelling in Missouri. To an outsider's passing glance, it was still the home of a doctor, respectable, whitewashed, with tidy shutters that closed neatly at night. But behind those shutters dwelt a silence broken only by the sounds of obedience, the creak of a stair tread late at night, the hushed shuffling of footsteps, an occasional strained voice smothered quickly into quiet. Neighbors who might pass by after dark swore they sometimes heard something else, carried on the wind, muffled cries cut short, rhythmic pounding like a hammer against wood, then sudden silence. But in the unforgiving world of mid-19th century Missouri, people had learned long ago the cost of curiosity. They averted their eyes. They shut their ears. They whispered, but they never acted. Inside those walls, Dr. Grayling had transformed his role from physician to monarch. His children were no longer seen as merely offspring, but vessels, raw material through which his vision might be tested, proven, perfected. He spoke to them less as a father than as a commanding officer, his words clipped, clinical, freighted with command. They were addressed by name only rarely. More often they were subject, followed by a number, the eldest, subject 1, then 2, then 3, down to the youngest, a little girl scarcely 6 years old, subject 5. In his journals, which would one day serve as the damning record of all he had done, he referred to them never as his sons or daughters, but as specimens. The boundaries of medicine had already been obliterated. He now undertook procedures that bore closer resemblance to cruelty than any tradition of healing. He pierced them with crude needles not to cure, but to see how long fever might spike, how long delirium might last. He subjected them to freezing baths in the dead of winter, forcing them to submerge until their lips turned blue, writing notes on their resilience and time to recovery. He bound their limbs with tight straps of leather to study the effects of circulation loss, then released them only to measure numbness and pain. Worst of all, Grayling had grown fascinated with the mind itself. He believed that emotion, intelligence, even morality could be reshaped by environment and stimulation. To him, the human soul was clay and he was the potter. And so began experiments not merely on their bodies but on their consciousness. He would deprive one of sleep for days, whispering questions at intervals to test coherence. He would isolate another child in a dark cellar, providing food only inconsistently, noting the psychological breakdown that followed. He devised punishments presented not as discipline but as observation, fear as an instrument, terror as a variable to be tested. In his ledger he wrote, "Fear is a lever. It pries open the nature of the subject. It reveals character at the roots. The children, who once bore names given with love at birth, Samuel, Elijah, Ruth, Miriam, and Thomas, were being erased piece by piece, replaced with something forged in fear. Neighbors commented on their eerie silence at church, their wide-eyed stares, their ghostly pallor. One local blacksmith confided privately that when young Samuel passed his smithy, the boy's arms bore scars not consistent with farm chores or childish accidents, but something deliberate, intentional. Yet these observations remained comments made in low tones, never accusations shouted aloud. To confront Grayling was to risk losing the only doctor within a sprawling 40-mile radius. Who would risk the lives of their own kin in exchange for the uncertain justice of strangers' children? But cracks in Grayling's system grew harder to conceal. In 1861, plague and fever swept parts of Missouri. Grayling offered relentless service, traveling farm to farm, often gone for days while his experiments continued in his absence under directions given to his wife, a woman described by one neighbor as a ghost still walking. Her complicity remains debated by historians. Was she herself a victim, broken to submission? Or did she believe her husband's claims of future glory, that their suffering children were paving a road to human advancement? Whatever truth lay behind her eyes, she said nothing, allowing the cycle of cruelty to continue unchecked. One winter, Elijah, then aged 10, was discovered nearly unconscious at the edge of the family's property. He had collapsed in the snow, lips blue, body quaking. A woodcutter spied him, carried him home, and summoned Grayling himself. The doctor's reaction chilled those in attendance. He took his son without thanks, muttering only that the boy was weaker than anticipated, and marched him home without further explanation. Elijah survived, though in later years he would never again speak more than a few words at a time. His voice cracked, his gaze hollow. To witnesses, the boy's silence was tragic. To Grayling, it was merely data, and all the while, Grayling's obsession grew more elaborate. He imported chemicals unseen by most frontier physicians, shipped at great cost from eastern cities, guarded carefully in crates marked with the insignias of universities or army suppliers. The shipments sparked curiosity among townsfolk, but when asked, Grayling would wave the question aside, insisting they were vital supplies against disease. Few dared press him, for in that era, a doctor could cloak his madness in the authority of science, and ordinary folk, unlettered, weary from toil, had no vocabulary with which to challenge him. But there was one man who began to ask harder questions. Reverend Silas Hooper, an aging but sharp-minded minister, had long looked with unease upon Grayling's family. He noticed how none of the children ever spoke during Sunday school, how bruises and tremors marred their faces and hands. At first he chalked it to overwork, perhaps even household discipline grown too stern. But to Silas's eyes it seemed worse. Twice he attempted to visit the Grayling home with the excuse of prayer. Twice he was denied entry into the study where the faint smell of chemicals lingered, acrid and pungent. His suspicions deepened, yet without evidence he stood powerless, bound by the same fear that gripped others. To speak out would mean alienating their only physician in an unforgiving land. Grayling himself seemed unconcerned. If anything, he wore his respectability with more polish than ever. He sat on local committees, offered advice on farming matters, and gave public speeches on hygiene. To many, he appeared the very model of civic virtue. But masks can become fragile when pressed too hard. And Grayling's mask was beginning to splinter beneath the weight of his zealotry. In the journals later recovered from his household, entries from this period demonstrate a chilling shift in language. Where once he spoke of improvement and advancement, he now wrote of culling weakness and exercising frailty. He saw his children less as heirs of blood than obstacles to be reworked, proof that even the natural order could be bent to willpower alone. One passage read, "Suffering is a crucible. They emerge not as they were, but as they must be." To Grayling, agony was no longer a byproduct. It was the essential method. The children endured mutilations of spirit that shaped them into something unrecognizable. Ruth, once bright and curious, grew withdrawn, staring for hours at nothing. Miriam developed sudden violence, lashing out at siblings only to collapse moments later into tearful remorse. Samuel walked stiffly, his left arm forever weakened from some procedure too devastating to heal cleanly. Young Thomas, the youngest, barely 6, wandered the town once, lost and trembling, muttering words nobody understood. A shopkeeper guided him home, but days later the boy was not seen outside again for years. Yet no matter how evident the decline, the doctor's social standing shielded him as effectively as fortress walls. For every whispered rumor, there was another grateful family whose child he had saved from scarlet fever or whose wound he had stitched cleanly. For every suspicion, there was a counterbalance of loyalty and gratitude, and so always silence prevailed. But silence has limits. When patterns of cruelty become visible, not simply to the eyes but to the conscience of a community, the weight becomes harder to bear. By 1862, Reverend Hooper resolved to act in whatever small way he could. He began keeping quiet notes of his own, oddities in the children's appearance, their injuries, their behaviors. He gathered testimonies whispered by wives, mothers, and farm workers. It was the beginning of a record that, years later, would be used to piece together the hidden crimes of a doctor whose mask fooled nearly all around him. For Grayling, however, that year marked another escalation. Civil war was raging through Missouri, violence and uncertainty spilling into every community. For him, the conflict was both excuse and opportunity. Chaos provided cover. Soldiers passed through. Bodies fell. Families vanished. What was one more household shrouded in strangeness, amidst so much broader death? His ledger from wartime is sparse, as though even he knew to disguise the extent of his experiments while soldiers patrolled and guerrilla bands raged. But within what entries survive, one sees trial after trial honing toward a dreadful end. He was no longer content to study endurance or illness alone. He now believed he could reshape identity itself. The children's voices, once distinct, began to blur into silence or hysteria. The few who encountered them wondered in later testimony if they had even remained children at all, or if Grayling's subjects, through years of torment, had become half-living shadows of humanity. In that transformation lay the true horror, not just the physical cruelty, but the stripping away of soul and identity until little remained but obedience, fear, and scars. The monster he created was not stitched from corpses, like fictional tales later spun in penny novels, nor was it born in a single chamber of horrors beneath his house. No, the monster was slower, subtler, more horrifying precisely because it was hidden in plain sight. It was built over years, whispered into being through needles and straps, through deprivation and terror, through the systematic breaking of his own bloodline. And still, it was only beginning. By 1863, whispers about Dr. Thaddeus Grayling had spread beyond the handful of cautious families who had dared voice them. They had become common currency, traded like smuggled goods across barroom tables and between pews after Sunday services. Farmers traveling from more distant counties claimed they had heard the doctor's name, and not always with admiration. In a time when war consumed Missouri and rumors of atrocities swept constantly across its borders, one might have thought Grayling's strangeness would be lost in the wider tumult. But it was precisely in times of chaos that communities looked closer at their neighbors, desperate to affirm who could truly be trusted. The Grayling children had grown into striking symbols of unease. Each bore marks of his father's hand, though none dared say it aloud. Samuel, now 17, moved with an awkward gait as if one leg no longer obeyed him fully. His eyes, once described as bright and quick, had dulled into a haunted stare. Elijah, the second-born, rarely spoke above a whisper, his body thin beyond health. Ruth and Miriam, the sisters, appeared fragile, withdrawn like young women who had known horrors they could not name. And Thomas, the youngest, alarmed everyone who caught a glimpse of him, his head disproportionately large for his narrow shoulders, his gaze darting with sudden intensity. He startled easily, sometimes breaking into fits of panic at small noises. Yet for all their obvious suffering, none of the children ever broke their father's command of silence. They carried his secret embodied in their trembling forms, and yet beyond silence the signs grew. Horses carrying supply crates to the Grayling home came more frequently than ever, filled with oddities few other physicians bothered to import. Glass vials clinking with unrecognizable liquids. These powders gave off acrid fumes, instruments of curious design. When townsfolk asked casually about these supplies, Grayling, ever poised, would feign irritation and claim they were necessities against contagion. Most accepted the explanation. After all, cholera and fever could sweep entire valleys. But the Reverend Silas Hooper was not so easily placated. By now, Hooper had built what might generously be called a case. Fragments of testimony, notes about the children's odd appearances, reports of crying murmured through shuttered windows. He carried these observations in a journal small enough to slip into his coat. When he spoke to others about it, however, he met the same reply, repeated with weary consistency. "You don't know what you're saying, Reverend. He delivered my wife when the fever nearly took her. He cut the infection from my boy's arm when no other man could. Who are we without him?" That was the wall Grayling had built. Gratitude laid stone by stone until it formed a fortress none dared to attack. And yet even fortresses can be undermined from within. Something in Grayling himself was changing. His notes grew more frenzied, his face more drawn. Those who saw him in town began to comment quietly that his composure had slipped. The meticulous polish of his hair and clothing faltered. He barked at merchants, snapping at minor delays. Children recoiled at his voice. Though it remained calm in tone, there was something beneath it, an edge so sharp it made even outsiders uneasy. For years he had lived behind a mask of refinement. Now the cracks began to show plainly. Inside his house, the experiments had reached their darkest. Grayling had moved beyond injections and medicines, beyond deprivation and isolation, into measures more terrible still. Samuel, the eldest, was increasingly absent from town, not by choice, but because his father's work had left his body too wrecked to walk without visible pain. Grayling measured his responses to electrical currents passed cruelly across muscles, recording spasms as data. Elijah endured a cycle of forced starvation offset by jolting feasts, his digestion observed like that of a laboratory specimen. Ruth and Miriam were subjected to trials intended to test resistance to illness, inhaling smoke from burning herbs mixed with toxins, exposure to untreated wounds deliberately infected. Every scream, every cough, every spasm was recorded in the small, neat script of Grayling's ruthless ledger. What disturbed Reverend Hooper most was the sense of calculation behind it all. This was not drunken cruelty, nor the angry lashings of a violent man's temper. It was, in its own twisted way, scientific. Grayling truly believed himself a pioneer, advancing human endurance, preparing a future where bodies were stronger, minds reshaped, and weakness eliminated. It was not madness born of insanity, it was the madness of logic inverted, compassion erased, ambition enthroned. Midway through 1863, the Reverend could hold silence no longer. In a fiery sermon delivered to a packed church, he spoke of wolves in sheep's clothing, of serpents who walked as angels of light, of the peril of trusting appearances. He never named Grayling directly, but the implication was unmistakable. Those who listened stiffened, some nodding in dark agreement, others muttering uneasily. Grayling himself was absent that morning, attending supposedly to a patient, but word carried swiftly. Later that week, he confronted the Reverend on the street. Witnesses described the moment with shivering detail, the doctor's voice calm, nearly friendly, his hand resting softly on the old man's shoulder as he said, "You should be careful where you place your faith. Silas, it is dangerous when a shepherd leads his flock astray. You wouldn't want to give them nightmares they don't already have." It was not merely a warning. It was a display of power, a reminder that even suspicion could be turned against the accuser. Silas trembled but did not relent. His notes grew longer, his efforts more deliberate. He knew now that the line between suspicion and truth was fine indeed. He felt it in his bones. Meanwhile, the children's condition could no longer disguise itself as simple misfortune. Samuel disappeared from public view altogether. Elijah occasionally stumbled through errands, his body so shrunken he seemed closer to a skeleton than a youth on the verge of manhood. Ruth and Miriam, glimpsed at the market, spoke only in hushed tones to one another, startled at the approach of strangers. And little Thomas developed a habit of sudden outbursts. Once, in the middle of the town square, he shrieked without reason, clutching his head as though voices tormented him. His father arrived moments later, seizing the boy roughly, muttering something about a fit, and disappearing with him into the shadows of his home. People began at last to whisper louder. Could it be true, the rumors that the doctor, so generous, so skilled, was hiding something monstrous? Could it be that his children's strangeness was born not of illness, but of deliberate cruelty? Yet the fear remained, a paralysis shaped by dependency, for still he healed their wounds, still he birthed their children. To challenge him outright felt like sawing off the very branch they sat upon. But time was running short. Grayling's experiments had reached a fever pitch. In his journals, he described a final synthesis, though what that meant none could say. He spoke of combining methods, testing thresholds, to the limit of mortality. He seemed less concerned with healing than with discovering where the line between life and death might blur, and whether it could be crossed at will. His children were no longer children in his eyes, but living crucibles, instruments through which he sought to forge new human possibilities. The reverence he once held for appearance, reputation, and community had corroded away. He had given up the mask. He cared now only for his dark triumph. The Reverend's notes for late 1863 carry an ominous summary. He is slipping. He will not hold himself in bounds much longer. Either he destroys his family and himself with them, or we must intervene. God help us all if we wait. And still, intervention did not come. Not yet. For the monster Grayling sought to build was still in progress, step by step, scar by scar, torment by torment. And its full emergence would demand even more suffering before the outside world could no longer look away. By the first frost of 1864, the Grayling household had become a place of both fascination and dread. To passers-by, it was simply another clapboard frame standing modest against the Missouri landscape, smoke curling from its chimney, shutters drawn tight against the howling wind. Yet to those who walked past at night, the house had grown uncanny. Shadows flickered too long in lamplight, screams rode faintly on the air only to be smothered, and an aura of sorrow seemed to cling to the very timbers. Dogs avoided the home, skirting its borders with whimpers, while local children dared each other to run to the gate and back in daylight, never once lingering after dusk. Word spread in careful riddles. There was something fundamentally wrong inside. Something people pretended not to see because the cost of acknowledging it was too great. Inside, Dr. Grayling was unraveling at a pace. His obsession had hardened to the point where his work consumed nearly every hour he remained in his home. He demanded his children's compliance without pause, cycling them through cycles of treatments, so exhausting that even his meticulous notes began to reveal desperation. His elite handwriting grew jagged. Where once his words spoke of theory and observation, they now carried feverish insistence, as though he himself had begun to believe his time was running short. Perhaps in his mind, the war raging across Missouri magnified his urgency. Maybe he feared discovery, or possibly what had begun as an obsession with science had transformed into something darker, domination for its own sake. Samuel, once the eldest son, had become a husk. In entries written in his father's ledger, phrases like "no longer viable," "resistant beyond measure," and "subject lapses into collapse" frame Samuel not as a son, but as a failed specimen. He rarely left his bed by that winter, his limbs stiff, twisted by repeated forced seizures and currents. Elijah fared little better, often described as unstable, his nervous system scarred by the endless pendulum of starvation and excess. Neighbors recalled later how Elijah would wander onto porches during storms, muttering incoherent fragments, only to be pulled away by his father with an iron grip and a cold voice. Ruth's pale frame shook with fevers induced by deliberate exposure to contagions Grayling brewed from livestock disease. Miriam bore teeth ground down by perpetual clenching, eyes darting in terror at the smallest sound, conditioned into twitching fear. And little Thomas, his body stunted, his speech fragmented, seemed increasingly more creature than child, lashing unpredictably, consumed by strange fits of anxiety that no comfort could calm. This was what Grayling called progress. When he wrote in his journal, his tone was triumphant. Endurance surpasses previous thresholds. Weakness transmuted into form anew. Suffering reveals the edge of transcendence. But to those who witnessed the children, there was no transcendence in sight. They were broken bodies animated by pain, a testament only to the cruelty of their father's ambition. The Reverend Silas Hooper pressed harder than ever into his quiet investigation. He spoke with wives who admitted privately that they had heard cries drifting from the Grayling home on still nights. He collected fragments of observations, the way the doctor's wife carried herself like a shadow, how one girl's hand appeared freshly scarred at market, the swollen bruises traced across a boy's neck. Some mothers clutched their own children tighter when confessing details, their words spilling half in fear, half in guilt. They knew something unspeakable lay behind Grayling's locked study, and they also knew none among them had yet raised more than murmurs. Silas grew convinced it could no longer be left. One evening, he addressed a small gathering of men in his study. He exhorted them with scripture about evil clothed in respectability, warning them that to remain silent was complicity in damnation. He spoke of the children's faces, their deformities of spirit and flesh, the hypocrisy of celebrating a healer who was at once a destroyer. Some men nodded, stirred not only by faith, but by a deep unease they could no longer bury. Others, hardened by years of dependence on Grayling's medical hand, shook their heads, warning Silas of the consequences. He has saved too many lives. If you accuse him and cannot prove it, Reverend, you'll be driven from this place, and so will every soul standing with you. The Reverend burned with frustration, but he did not relent. He also knew he treaded dangerous ground, for his sermon against serpents weeks earlier had already summoned Grayling's quiet threat. When walking through town, he began to feel eyes on him, sometimes townsfolk whispering, sometimes the steely gaze of Grayling himself, who seemed to pass by with unnatural frequency. Fear pressed the old man, but conviction pressed harder. He resolved to act cautiously, gathering evidence until it spoke with an undeniable voice. Meanwhile, Grayling's escalating mania drew him closer to catastrophe. One winter evening, Ruth collapsed publicly while carrying goods from the marketplace. Blood poured from her nose and mouth, staining the snow. Spectators rushed forward, horrified, and were met moments later by Grayling himself, arriving with frightening speed. With polished calm, he ordered them aside, lifting his daughter effortlessly and muttering about a delicate condition. He walked away with her before anyone could speak further. Word of the scene spread rapidly, but Grayling's authorities silenced it for days. Many people wanted to know what frailty had caused such a collapse in a girl of her age. Few dared. Still, the fear that shadowed him widened. Mothers began whispering warnings to keep children away from the Grayling home. Men who once greeted him with cordial bows now averted their eyes, uncertain whether they were safe under his gaze. Grayling responded not with humility, but with hardening pride. He leaned further into the rituals of science, locking his household even more tightly. Nights burned with lamplight behind his shuttered windows, stretching until dawn. Strange smells seeped on the wind, chemical scents too sharp for common medicines. Horses hauling his supplies arrived at odder hours. The middle of the night, the earliest before dawn, as if what lay concealed inside had at last become too shameful for daylight. In his journals, he wrote more openly of ambition, less of medicine. The body is mutable. The mind is clay. What man forbids in cowardice, I attempt with courage. If they fear me, so be it, for fear is the threshold of reverence. His tone was shifting from the secretive academic to the self-styled prophet. The man who believed himself the lone pioneer dragging humanity forward through brutality only he had the vision to justify. In his mind, he was not shattering his children. He was forging something eternal, transcendent, above crude morality. But in the hearts of neighbors, fear was itself forging something else, resistance. Whispers that had curled timidly in corners were now murmured more boldly near hearths and homes that barred their doors at night. They shared what they had seen, what they suspected, what their souls told them could no longer be ignored. Yet still they hesitated. The war had stripped their lands of many protectors. Fear of guerrilla raiders, fear of disease, fear of hunger, all weighed alongside fear of the doctor. To act was to risk the wrath of a man many still trusted for survival. The balance teetered. The breaking point would come not from adults, but from children. In the spring thaw of 1864, a group of local boys hunting rabbits stumbled too near the Grayling property. Creeping close to the window of the shuttered home, one claimed he saw through a brief gap in the curtain what looked like a figure strapped across a table, arms spread, head turned slack against wood, blotched marks across the skin. Another boy swore he heard screams, muffled, cut short by something metallic slamming hard. The boys fled, pale, telling no one at first. In weeks to come, two would confess nervously to their mothers, sparking fresh unease across the community. It was this whisper, the innocence of children too young to invent such horrors, that spurred action at last. Silas Hooper, bone-weary but resolute, convened another hushed gathering. This time his words fell with harder force. "The blood cries out for justice," he thundered softly in his parlor. "If we wait longer, these innocents will perish. And then their blood is on our hands." A silence followed, heavy, charged, until the first nods turned into solemn vows. In that moment, the spell of Grayling's absolute protection began its first true crack. And behind his shutters, The doctor himself, fevered in his journals and half deranged with sleepless cruelty, could feel the town's shifting air. His notes for April 1864 resonated with defiance. They do not understand. They cannot. Soon the work will be proven. Soon the weakness of man will be swept aside, and I will stand where all others dared not tread. Soon, always soon, the monster he had labored to create was nearly complete. By the summer of 1864, the Grayling home had become more fortress than residence. Its windows remained shuttered day and night, even when the June heat pressed into the valley like a furnace. Neighbors passing by noted the absence of children's laughter, the stillness so profound it felt unholy. Yet at irregular hours, lamplight leaked through cracks in curtains, and strange noises carried across the fields. Hammering, clattering, muffled cries, sometimes a scream so sharp even the dogs fell silent. The house seemed alive with secrets too heavy for walls to contain. Dr. Thaddeus Grayling was losing command of the mask he had worn for nearly 2 decades. Where once he carried himself with poise, crisp in his attire and measured in his words, now he slouched with sunken eyes, his clothes disheveled, his beard untended. He prowled the town with an intensity that made grown men step back. When he entered the apothecary, silence rippled outward, and hands stilled until he left. Everyone still needed him, yet everyone feared him. A doctor held power over life and death. Grayling, however, wielded that power with something more terrifying than authority. He wielded it with contempt. His journals revealed the transformation. Phrases once clinical, measurements, symptoms, reactions, degenerated into proclamations of destiny. The weak will fall, the strong will rise. From my hands will come the new flesh, unburdened by frailty. He no longer viewed his experiments as incremental progress, but as pieces of a grand revelation. Obsessed with the idea that pain unlocked hidden endurance, he sought ever more extreme methods. His children no longer bore the resemblance of youth, but of withered subjects sacrificed to his obsession. Samuel, his eldest, could barely leave his bed, his body twisted from repeated convulsions inflicted by electrical shocks. Elijah, near skeletal, wandered muttering phrases too broken to follow. Ruth's hair thinned from months of recurring illness induced deliberately by her father's concoctions. Miriam clenched her teeth until blood streaked her tongue. And young Thomas, his outbursts now so violent they frightened even siblings, was being reshaped into what Grayling believed his grand experiment demanded. A child driven not by ordinary affection but conditioned terror. A perfect organism honed by suffering rather than nurtured by love. Yet it was this very extremity that betrayed him. In late July, laborers working along the creek near the Grayling property reported finding blood in the water. Whether it was animal or human, none could say. But in a town already alive with whispers, speculation leapt like fire. Mothers pulled their children closer when word spread. Men talked in hushed voices at saloons. And Reverend Silas Hooper seized on it like tinder-meeting flame. Hooper had waited years, earnestly, believing faith and persistence might bring hidden truth into light, but time had run its course. With Ruth's collapse in public still gnawing at memory, with children's testimony about pale figures strapped to boards still circling, and now fresh rumors of blood seeping into common water, he decided silence was no longer an option. In early August, he summoned a discreet but urgent meeting of townsfolk in his modest parsonage. Word traveled swiftly, and by candlelight, nearly 24 men and women assembled. Some came with fear plain in their eyes, others with folded arms and hardened suspicion of gossip. Hooper spoke with the clarity of one who had borne a burden too long. For years, he began, voice quivering with age yet steady with resolve. I have watched and recorded what most of you have only whispered. We have looked away, convinced ourselves nothing was amiss, because we needed him. But look at his children. Look at their faces. Tell me they are not ruined in body and soul. He revealed his small notebook, filled with years of entries, dates, observations, scraps of testimony. Eyes widened, murmurs rippled. Men exchanged uneasy glances, wives clutched rosaries, and someone muttered aloud what others thought but dared not voice. He ain't a doctor. He's something else, something worse. But even as resolve flickered into being, fear pushed back. One farmer slammed his palm on the table. If we rise against him and we're wrong, who will deliver our wives? Who will tend our sick when fever comes? And there lay the paradox that had bound them for so long. They feared him more than any sickness, yet they also feared losing the only physician within miles. It was Silas who broke the impasse. "Better no doctor at all," he thundered softly, "than a physician who slaughters his own flesh in the name of pride. Grayling is not our savior. He is our ruin." That night no plan of decisive action emerged, but the seed had taken root. Eyes hardened with conviction. Suspicion became belief. Belief began to harden into intent. Grayling, it seemed, sensed the shift before it ever broke into open confrontation. His notes from late August carried a new edge of paranoia. "The town stirs. They mutter about me. They lack the courage to confront the truth, yet they sense it. So be it. If they come, they will meet what I have wrought. Let them look upon it and tremble." His handwriting, once neat and measured, spiraled into jagged scrawls, whole pages filled with rambling about fear as the crucible of divinity. It was not the careful mind of a physician speaking anymore, but the fevered manifesto of a zealot. And yet, amid his mania, his careful discipline cracked. One night, a scream carried far too loudly into the town. It was followed by another, higher, sharper, distinctly childlike. And unlike before, it did not die away quickly. It went on, echoing into the valley, chilling blood even among hardened men. Doors swung open. Men stepped onto porches, staring into the dark. Lamps lit one by one until a line of weary eyes illuminated the road. No one approached the house that night, but every soul who heard knew beyond denial that horror dwelt within. The following morning, Grayling appeared in town. His clothes were blood-stained at the cuffs, though he tried to disguise them beneath his coat. People noticed. People recoiled. He ordered medicines brusquely, snapping at the apothecary about incompetence. Gone was the old performance of calm respect. What returned in its place was hostility raw and undisguised. He dared them to question him now. No one did then, but the silence that followed was heavy with decision. By mid-September, small acts of resistance began. Women pulled their children away when he passed. Farmers who once offered him transport in their wagons left him to walk. And Reverend Hooper pressed harder, visiting homes nightly, urging them to prepare for the reckoning he warned was drawing near. The town had lived in awe of Grayling, but awe had curdled into dread, and dread into something sharper. Anger simmered beneath their fear, a hunger for justice long suppressed. What none of them yet knew was that within Grayling's home, his final synthesis was underway. The journals spoke of it repeatedly. Subject 5 shows endurance beyond expectation. Curvature improving. Fractures result in discipline. Survivor by necessity. The new flesh emerges. The notes implied that Thomas, the youngest, had become the centerpiece of Grayling's dream. The child most malleable, conditioned into something outside ordinary humanity. Exactly what Grayling hoped to reveal remained shrouded, but words like completion and demonstration appeared again and again. It was as if Grayling no longer cared to hide. He wanted them to see. He wanted the town to behold his creation, and soon they would. By October of 1864, Missouri's fields had begun to wither into autumn gray, the war drums of the nation echoing faintly across the riverside towns. Yet for the small community surrounding Dr. Thaddeus Grayling's home, another war was already in motion. A more personal battle for survival, for sanity, for the souls of children lost to experiments no man should ever have dared. The Reverend Silas Hooper had spent the entire summer laying groundwork, building what courage he could kindle in the hearts of neighbors. Fear still writhed in their voices when Grayling's name was spoken aloud, but fear now walked hand in hand with rage. The screams heard weeks earlier still haunted their sleep. Mothers pressed their hands over their children's ears at night, as though shielding them from echoes carried on the wind. And men who once smiled in gratitude when Grayling saved their loved ones now clenched fists in secret, muttering bitterly of debts they were finished paying. The Reverend's journal from those weeks reveals a grim determination. The time draws nigh. His sins cry out louder than any preacher could. The people feel them, though their tongues falter. Yet soon even silence will fail him. Grayling himself sensed it too. He carried himself differently in town by that autumn, no longer like a healer earning admiration, but like an outlaw daring anyone to cross him. His eyes were wild, his tone clipped, and even the smallest interaction carried menace. When a merchant dared ask after the well-being of his children, Grayling leaned close enough to measure the man's breath and whispered, "They are mine. Mine to shape, mine to raise. You'd do well not to forget your own place." The merchant dared no further words, but later confessed to his wife he had never known such terror from simple conversation. Inside his home, Grayling's obsession had reached its terrible crescendo. His notebooks overflowed with scratches of ink, symbols, wave-like graphs, meticulous diagrams of human forms annotated with words like tensile, resilient, reborn. He spoke in his notes with religious fervor, as though he were no longer conducting experiments but delivering prophecy. Through them will come what man has feared, perfection carved in scar and sinew. Let them condemn me if they must, but in time they will return to kneel, begging the mercy of my wisdom. I am the next scripture. The centerpiece of these final experiments was Thomas, the youngest, once tender and bright, now broken into something neither wholly boy nor wholly sane. Grayling praised him feverishly in his journals. Subject 5 rises where the rest failed. Fear burns away weakness. Endurance outstrips all predecessors. He screams, yet he survives again and again. The flesh remembers. Whether Thomas's endurance was true or merely survival clawed from relentless torment, it mattered little to Grayling. In the doctor's fevered mind, Thomas had become the proof. But proof for whom? That question was answered in the chilling phrase Grayling scrawled across the final page of one surviving notebook. They will see. They must see. The town shall bear witness, and all doubt shall fall away. It was clear by autumn that Grayling intended to reveal something. Whether as demonstration, spectacle, or punishment, no one could guess. But knowledge of his intent injected urgency into Reverend Hooper's nightly gatherings. Farmers, craftsmen, mothers, and even wary youths gathered at the parsonage attic in lamplight. Hooper spoke with gravity, hammering the words into men's hearts. If we stand by, we share his crime. Better to fall with righteousness than live shackled beneath his shadow. The plan that emerged was not simple, for they acted without law at their back. Federal troops roamed Missouri sporadically, focused on war, not one doctor's secluded terror. Local sheriffs were absent or indifferent. This was to be citizen action, raw and perilous, as much vigilante as justice. Hooper urged caution, but the people, kindled by years of repressed suffering, leaned toward fury. They whispered of storming the house, of tearing his shutters down to drag into daylight whatever horrors lay strapped behind them. Meanwhile, Grayling pressed forward, seemingly unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, that his mask had fallen almost completely. He did not shy away from the stairs when he came to town. He courted them. To some he muttered cryptic fragments like scripture. Pain is birth, he would say. You will understand soon. Once he told a mother clutching her child in the town square, grieve not for the weak. What survives is what God himself desires. She left shaken for days, convinced she had looked into the eyes of a man possessed. The moment of collision arrived not with a wary strategy, but with a loud accident. One cold October evening, a sound tore through the valley so awful it electrified even the night. A drawn-out wail, followed by thundering crashes of heavy furniture overturned, glass shattering across wood, and a voice shouting in fevered proclamation, "Behold, the new flesh rises." That was all it took. Families bolted upright in their beds. Men seized lanterns and axes. Within half an hour of the sound, nearly 30 townsfolk had gathered on the road outside Grayling's house. Their torches burned under the stars, flickering red against their hardened faces. Some trembled, some clenched their teeth, but all knew the silence of passivity was broken. Reverend Hooper, trembling with the weight of years, stepped forward first. His voice rang out strong against the shuttered house. "Thaddeus Grayling, by God and conscience, open your door. Show us what you've wrought, and answer for the charges we no longer can ignore." No answer came at first, only silence, deep and oppressive. Then slowly, the sound of latches moving, locks sliding free. The great front door creaked open. Grayling stood in the entry, lantern light clawing across his face. To those nearest he appeared almost transformed, wild-eyed, his skin sallow with exhaustion, streaked with sweat, his coat stained with substances they dared not guess. But it was his smile, thin and feverish, that froze the blood of even the boldest among them. "You come at last," he murmured, voice hoarse yet tinged with triumph. Good. Bear witness, neighbors, doubters, heretics of progress. You will not speak in whispers any longer. You will speak my truth. Behind him, shadows writhed in frenzied lamplight. Some swore later they saw a figure bound upright in the gloom, moving with spasms unnatural. Others claimed shapes scurried briefly across the edges of vision, too twisted to name. The stench that poured from the doorway was unmistakably human, but fouled with rot and chemicals. The crowd gasped, men stepping back, women clutching their mouths. Grayling stepped fully into view, spreading his arms as though before an audience at a grand sermon. What God began in weakness, I have finished in strength. That which you called children has become the raw material of something greater. You dared to pity them, but you shall envy them. Look and despair for all that you have lacked the courage to attempt. It was Reverend Hooper, voice trembling yet defiant, who answered him. You are no prophet, Grayling. You are no healer. You are a butcher of your own children, and by the Lord this town will suffer your madness no further. The crowd roared, not with words, but with a sound heated by generations of suppressed fear. Torches lifted, feet surged forward. For the first time, Grayling's authority fractured. The fortress he had built out of reputation, gratitude, and fear cracked wide open under the weight of citizen fury. Grayling, wild grin still painted across his weary face, did not retreat. Instead, he stepped back into the house, calling over his shoulder, "Then come inside. Come see what your cowardice has denied you." A tense silence followed, broken only by the sound of a child's shriek from within. The mob surged. The crowd surged across the threshold with the force of pent-up years, lanterns flashing, boots thudding against floorboards that groaned beneath the sudden weight of vengeance. The house that had stood silent so long now erupted with human voices, a maelstrom of torches and fury spilling into rooms long sealed from daylight. At the forefront walked the Reverend, shaking not with fear but with grim resolve, his lined face lit in orange glow. Behind him came farmers wielding axes meant for wood, pitchforks meant for hay, ropes meant for livestock, but tonight repurposed for justice. What they found froze even their rage into breathless horror. The smell hit first, a stench of rot, sour and chemical, like sickness mixed with smoke. Then their eyes adjusted to the lamplight. The walls were lined not with books or furniture, but with shelves of glass jars. Twisted organs suspended in cloudy fluid, bones carefully labeled in Grayling's neat hand, limbs preserved as specimens. Notes, diagrams, and scraps of drawings littered every surface, pinned with tacks and chaotic arrangements. What had once been a doctor's study was now a chamber of desecrated science, and then the figures came into view. Samuel lay strapped to a board, his body so emaciated he seemed more skeleton than flesh, yet his chest still rose weakly. His fingers twitched against restraints. His eyes flickered open, only briefly, and in them was no recognition, only a deep, endless void carved by years of agony. Beside him, Elijah crouched in a corner, muttering endlessly to himself, rocking back and forth. Shadows of old scars lined his arms, and at the sight of strangers, he howled like an animal cornered. Ruth and Miriam lay together on a cot, their hands clasped, but their bodies shook with tremors so violent one might have thought the very floor quaked beneath them. Their hair matted, their lips cracked, eyes wild and rolling. And Thomas stood at the far wall, unbound, yet scarcely human in comportment. His frame was slight yet misshapen, his eyes darting, his shoulders quivering with tension. But his gaze, unlike his siblings, was alive with something fierce, unblinking, and dreadful. Torches wavered. More than one man gagged. The women among them clutched at mouths, tears streaming silently. The illusion was gone, the whispers proven. This was no healer's house, but a cathedral of torment. At the center of it all stood Dr. Thaddeus Grayling himself, lantern in hand, his expression radiant and grotesque, a saint of madness reveling as the congregation finally gathered. "Yes!" he cried, his voice towering above the horror. "See them! My works, my flesh! From their suffering, I have drawn forth strength no other dared. They endure what you never could. They are more than children now. They are harbingers of what humanity must become." The Reverend stepped forward, voice cracking. "They are children, Grayling. Your children." "God did not make them vessels for your delusions." Grayling sneered. God? God made them weak. His fist struck his chest. "I carved away the rot. I stripped the frailties. I am the surgeon of destiny. The crowd roared back, anger overcoming shock. One man raised his pitchfork as if to charge. But Grayling motioned with a sweeping hand and Thomas moved. The boy darted forward with startling speed, his strength unnatural, his scream piercing, animalistic. He clawed at the man's chest, tearing coat and flesh alike before others pried him away. Shock rippled through the mob. Gasps erupted, Grayling's grin widened. You see? You doubted, but behold, strength born of fire. He survives all I gave him, and still he rises. He is the monster you feared, and he is proof I was right. But the proof, to the crowd, was a condemnation. Faces twisted in horror and sorrow as they recoiled, not from the child, but from the father who had twisted him so. Cries of monster and devil filled the rooms. The Reverend raised his lantern. No more, Thaddeus. His voice trembled, but the words carried. No more will you hide behind the mask of a healer. Tonight the Lord's justice comes. Grayling's eyes flickered with genuine fear for the first time. For all his mania, he could read the faces before him, no longer uncertain, no longer bound by gratitude. This was not a town in awe of its doctor. It was a mob in judgment. He lunged toward Thomas, gripping the boy's arm, half as shield, half as prize. Stay back! He is mine! Mine! Without me he cannot live. Without me. But Thomas, writhing in his father's grip, cried out with a raw, broken voice. No! And in his scream was not obedience but fury. The boy wrenched free with strength, born of desperation, driving Grayling backward into the crowd's advance. Chaos erupted. Men surged forward, ropes snapping out, pinning Grayling's arms. He thrashed, teeth bared, his once respected voice reduced to guttural curses and proclamations. You fools, you cowards of weakness. You damn yourselves to decay. You will see. You will all see. Yet his words drowned beneath the roar of townsfolk, their long patience broken. They dragged him into the open, past his grotesque journals, past the jars of preserved limbs, past the children he had ruined with his experiments. The House of Silence sang now with human voices, crying not in whispers, but in united fury. Grayling's reign ended not with a scalpel or science, but with ropes, strong hands, and the convulsive, desperate defiance of a man unmasked. Outside, under October stars, the mob dragged him into the square. He fought like a trapped beast, but for every blow, 10 hands bound him tighter. Women screamed condemnation, and children wept at the sight of the man who had once been their trusted physician, revealed now as a nightmare. They bound him to a post, voices clamoring for justice. Some demanded fire, others cried for hanging. The Reverend raised both hands, urging restraint. We are not butchers as he was. We will grant him the justice he denied his children, the dignity of lawful judgment, though no law beyond us remains. But the faces before him, twisted by grief and rage, cared little for philosophy. They did not want the law. They wanted reckoning. At the edge of the crowd, Elijah suddenly staggered into view, drawn by the noise. His muttering fell silent as he beheld his father bound, and for the first time in memory, clarity seemed to dawn in his broken eyes. He whispered only one word, enough. The silence fell heavy. That single word, from lips long resigned to madness, carried a heavier weight than all Hooper's sermons combined. The crowd shouted anew, not in debate but in decision. Dr. Thaddeus Grayling, a physician from Missouri, an experimenter on his own blood and creator of monsters, had reached his final day. And as the rope was lifted, as the crowd prepared to exact the end, the night hung heavy, filled not only with rage, but with the deeper sorrow that justice could never remake what had already been broken beyond repair. The October night bore witness to the reckoning of Thaddeus Grayling. Bound to the post in the square, lanterns casting long, grotesque shadows across his gaunt frame, the once revered physician spat curses into the cool air. His voice cracked but did not falter, carrying a venomous certainty until the end. You will regret this, he snarled. You live in frailty. Your children will perish as mine nearly did. You could have been remade, and instead you cling to weakness. You condemn yourselves. These words might once have chilled the assembly, for Grayling had carried the authority of science and medicine. But that night, they rang hollow. The people looked upon him and saw not a savior, nor a pioneer, nor even a man driven by belief. They saw only a butcher, stripped of dignity, his intellect drowned in madness. Reverend Hooper stood tall before the mob, lantern lifted high, his voice cutting through the multitude. You stand here not because fate wronged you, but because you chose wrong. You twisted God's gifts into weapons. You turned fatherhood into cruelty, healing into destruction, and for every ounce of torment you inflicted, you will answer, not only to us, but to the Lord whose image you defiled. The rope was wound with fingers calloused by farm labor, tightened in hands that had known toil, hunger, and grief, but never the indulgence of cruelty for its own sake. And when at last the knot was secured around the beam rising above, the men stepped back, their faces grim. Women pulled their children close. Silence fell like snow, thick and suffocating save for Grayling's ragged breath. The call was made. The rope drew taut, and Missouri's most trusted physician, the man who had played at being both healer and God, dropped into eternity, his body swung in the lantern glow, a grotesque punctuation upon years of whispered fear. The curses that had dripped from his lips gave way to the stark inevitability of silence. For the first time, the people of the town could look at him without a mask, without illusion. There was no power left in his frame. There was no genius, no prophet, no doctor. There remained only a man stripped bare in his defeat, remembered not for healing but for horror. The townsfolk dispersed slowly, torches dimming against the night. Some wept openly for the children who had suffered so long, their figures scarred not only in body but in mind. A mother clutched her little boy to her breast and whispered, "We did nothing too long." A father spat into dirt, muttering, "Let him hang there come dawn." "Let the sun see what he did." Reverend Hooper lingered until the square emptied. His eyes found Samuel, Elijah, Ruth, Miriam, and Thomas, still huddled near the parsonage where families carried them gently after pulling them from their home of torment. They trembled against blankets pressed into their thin arms. The children were free, but none knew what the future held for them. Their scars went deeper than flesh. Their souls had been shaped by years of cruelty. "God grant them peace," whispered Silas, his voice breaking. "And God forgive us for waiting so long." What became of the Grayling children after that night is uncertain, for records scatter like leaves in autumn wind. Some say Samuel lingered only a short while longer, his frame too battered to recover. Others believe Elijah vanished into the wilderness, muttering prayers into the trees until no one heard him again. Ruth and Miriam were rumored to have been taken in by families in neighboring towns, though whispers claimed they never spoke more than a handful of sentences for the rest of their lives. And Thomas, the boy twisted most deeply into his father's proof. His fate remains the darkest shadow. Some swear he died within the year, his body broken past repair. Others claimed sightings of a gaunt young man lurking at the edges of farms, glaring with wild eyes that rolled toward the hills. Perhaps his torment ensured he would never truly escape. Possibly, in a way, Thaddeus Grayling had succeeded too well in shaping him. The town itself carried scars, too. They had lived for years under the shadow of a man they trusted. They had brought him gifts at Christmas, thanked him when their children healed, and invited him to their tables in gratitude. And all the while, horrors rattled behind shuttered windows. To realize how blind they had been was its own torment, and for many, faith in both men and institutions never fully returned. When later years brought new doctors, they arrived under scrutiny heavier than any other profession. The people had learned too dearly that evil could wear the mask of help. Historians who pieced together Grayling's story from fragments, Hooper's journal, scattered testimony, and the recovered notebooks from the doctor's study argue still about his true nature. Was he a mad scientist, believing he pushed humanity forward? Was he a sadist, cloaking cruelty beneath the guise of medicine? Or was he something more complicated? A man who began earnestly, only to let obsession consume him until morality dissolved entirely. In truth, it hardly matters. Whatever his intent, his children bore the scars. His community bore the shame, and history bore his lesson, that the greatest dangers may not always come from frontier bandits or open war, but from the quiet corruption of trusted power within one's own community. In the end, Grayling did create a monster, but it was not a child twisted against nature, nor a body dragged into grotesque transformation. The monster he created was himself, the doctor who had been given the gift of healing and turned it into a curse. Reflecting on his legacy, Reverend Hooper wrote one final entry. "Evil wears many masks. Sometimes it wears respectability, sometimes kindness. Beware the man who demands your gratitude while he hides his work in shadows." If we had heeded sooner, perhaps more souls would have been spared. But let our silence be a warning to others. When whispers of wrong rise, do not bury them, for buried wrongness festers into horror. And so the story of Thaddeus Grayling passed into hushed legend among the farms and fields of Missouri, an American Gothic tale carved into the wood and soil. For generations, parents used his name in warning to children. Trust those who heal. But remember, even healers are men, and men may carry darkness in their hearts. If this story gave you chills, share it with a friend who loves tales of dark history. And before you go, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hit the like button and leave a comment below. Do you believe Grayling's cruelty was true madness? Or was it cold, calculated science that stripped away morality? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Because stories like this remind us, the past is never as far away as we think. And sometimes history's monsters wore the very faces we trusted most.